Okay, so before we go to your Friedberg, I'm just going to read what Section 230 is. This is part of a law basically designed to protect common carriers, web hosters of legal claims that come from hosting third-party information. Here's what it reads. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So what this basically means is if you put a blog post up and people comment on it, you're not responsible for their comments. Or if you're Medium and you host the blog, you're not responsible for the comments of that person. It is that person's. It makes complete logical sense. The entire internet was based off of this, that platforms are not responsible for what people contribute to those platforms. That's how publishing works. If you look at the internet as paper.
Okay, but again, let's build on this. When that law was originally written, we had no conception of social distribution and algorithmic feeds that basically pumped content and increased the volume on those things. So what you have now is really no different than if, you created a show on Netflix or HBO or CBS and put it out there. If that stuff contained, something that was really offensive, those companies are on the hook. Did they make it? Yeah. No. Did they distribute it? Yes. And it's but
here's the difference.
It's the Netflix, but it's the active act of distributing it. You cannot look at these companies and say they are basically holding their hands back. They have written active code, and there is technical procedures that they are in control of that are both the amplifier and the kill switch.
But isn't this a bad analogy, Netflix? Shouldn't the analogy be the person who makes film stock, or the person who makes the camera, or the person who develops the film, not the person who distributes it?
No, because a
limited amount of shows on Netflix. You can police all of them. You can't police everything written.
Netflix is making editorial decisions about which shows to publish, just like a magazine makes editorial decisions about which articles to publish. They are clearly publishers. But the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, the original distinction, if you want to think about it like in offline terms for a second, you've got this idea of publishers and distributors, right? That's a fundamental dichotomy. A magazine would be a publisher. The newsstand on which it appears is a distributor. It shouldn't be liable. If there's a libelous article contained in that magazine, you shouldn't be able to sue every single newsstand in the country that made that magazine available for sale. That was the original offline law that was then kind of ported over into Section 230. It made a lot of sense. Without this, I think it was a really visionary provision. It was passed in 1996. Without that, every time that somebody sends an email that potentially created a legal issue, Gmail could have been liable.
Friedberg, what's the right analogy? When people post to the internet, is the analogy paper or film stock? Is it the newsstand or is it the publisher?
So remember, what Sachs is pointing out is this was passed in 1996. So think back to 1996 when you would create some content, right? And the term around that time was user-generated content, right? You guys remember this, the early days. It was the big sweeping
UGC.
Trend. UGC. And it was the big sweeping trend was oh my God, all this content is being created by the users. We don't have to go find content creators to create, a reason for other consumers to want to come to our websites. So users could create content. Blogger was an early kind of user-generated content service. You could create a blog post, you could post it, and people would show up. The problem with Blogger, or the challenge, was distribution or syndication, right? Now I've posted my content, how do I, as that content creator, get people to read my content? And you'd have to send people a link to a website, a link to a web page, and you click on that link, and then you could read it. What Chamath is pointing out is that today, Twitter and Facebook make a choice about, and YouTube make a choice about what content to show. And so, I think the analogy in the offline sense...
Via the algorithm is what you're saying, to be clear.
Via the algorithm. And, YouTube realized that if they showed you videos that they think that you'll click on, they'll keep you on YouTube longer and make more money from ads. So it keeps the cycle going. And so they optimize content. And it turns out that the content that you need to optimize for to get people to keep clicking is content that is somewhat activating to the amygdala in your brain. It's stuff that makes you angry or makes you super pleasured, and not just boring, ordinary stuff. And so this sort of content, which the New York Post sells a lot of, is the sort of stuff that rises to the top of those algorithms naturally because of the way they operate. Now, if a magazine stand were to put those newspapers, using the offline analogy, on the front of their magazine stand and told people walking by in the street, hey, you guys should check these out. Top of the news is Hunter Biden smoking crack with a hooker. People would, probably stop. But I think the question is, should they be liable? Now, in I think 2000, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act was passed. And that act basically created a process by which folks who felt like, and it was related to copyright, but I think the analogy is similar. If you thought that your content was copyrighted and was being put up falsely or put up without your permission, you could make a claim to one of those platforms to get your content pulled down. And I think the question is there some sort of analogy around libel content or false or misleading content that maybe this evolves into law, where there's a process by which platforms can kind of be challenged on what they're showing, much like they are with the DMCA takedown notices.
So I think the problem comes back to the code. If you explicitly write code that fundamentally makes it murky, whether you are the publisher or the distributor, I think that you have to basically take the approach that you are both. And then you should be subject to the laws of both. If, for example, Twitter did not have any algorithmic redistribution amplification, the only way you could get content was in a real-time feed that was everything that your friends posted, and they stayed silent, you could make a very credible claim that they are a publisher and not a distributor.
Which, by the way, is the way it originally worked. And it was why they were falling behind Facebook, as you well know, because you worked on the algorithm at Facebook.
You cannot claim you're not a distributor when you literally have a bunch of people that sit beside you writing code that decides what is important and what is not. You can debate. You can debate which signals they decide to use, but it is their choice.
Well, but if the signals are the user's own clicks, then I would argue that's still just user-generated content.
No. It is a signal, David, but that's not the only signal. For example, I can tell you very clearly that we would choose a priori stuff that we knew you would click on. It wasn't necessarily the most heavily clicked. We could make things that were lightly clicked more clicked. We could make things that were more clicked less clicked. But my point is, there are people inside the bowels of these companies that are deciding what you and your children see. And to the extent that that's okay, that's okay.
So wait. Maybe we've actually solved this problem, Sachs, in that if we said, if you deploy an algorithm that is not disclosing how this is going, then you are ergo a publisher. And if you are just showing it reverse chronological, R-chron, as we used to call it back in the day, with the newest thing up top, that would be so maybe we should be not getting rid of 230. We should be talking to these politicians about algorithms equal publisher. So the publisher at the New York Post is the same as the algorithm. I like this as a better framework.
Well, yeah. So Senator Tom Cotton, who's a Republican, he tweeted in response to the New York Post censorship, look, if you guys are going to act like publishers, we're going to treat you like publishers. So that's not modifying Section 230. That's just saying you're not going to qualify for Section 230 protection anymore if you're going to make all these editorial decisions. I would argue that these decisions they're making about censoring specific articles, and by the way, it's a total double standard because, when Trump's tax returns came out a week or two ago, where was the censorship of that? Wasn't that hacked material? I mean, that was material that found its way to the New York Times without Trump's consent. By the way, so were the Pentagon Papers. I mean, you cannot apply this standard, this idea that we're going to prohibit links to articles.
But you're proving the point. These people are publishers.
I know. Well, hold on. I'm saying if they make editorial decisions, they're publishers. I think there's a way for them to employ speech neutral rules and remain distributors. So I would have a little bit of an issue with you. I would say the reason why they're going to fall into this trap of becoming publishers is because of their own desire to censor, their own biases. They can't.
I don't think that's what it is. I think it's purely market cap driven. If you go from an algorithmic feed to a reverse chronological feed only, I can tell you what will happen, in my opinion, which is that the revenue monetization on a per page, per impression basis will go off by 90%.
90% for sure. People wouldn't.
That is the only reason why these guys won't switch, because they know that for every $1 billion they make today, it would go to 100 million in a reverse chronological feed, because you would not be able to place ads in any coherent, valuable way. There would be zero click-throughs and the ads would be just worthless. Otherwise, they should do it now. If you could keep all the revenue and you could be reverse chronological, right, and have the same market cap, just do it and be under safe harbor so that you're not attacked every day. How fun is it to be sitting there and being attacked every single day
by both sides,
by
all the libertarians in the middle?
The reason they don't do it is because of money. Let's just be honest. That's the only reason they don't do it. It's all market cap driven.
Maybe they should go back to just kind of the straight reverse chron feed. And maybe you're right that I think you probably are right that the algorithms make the situation worse, because they kind of trap people in these bubbles of like reinforcement, and they just keep being fed more ideological purity. And it definitely is fueling the polarization of our society. So I'm not trying to defend. I mean, I think maybe you have a point that we should get rid of these algorithms, but just to think about like the publisher aspect of it, going back to the newsstand example, let's say that the guy who works at the newsstand knows his customers and pulls aside every month the magazines that he knows that his clientele wants. And in fact, sometimes he even makes recommendations knowing that, oh, okay, Chamath likes, these 3 magazines. Here's a new one. Maybe he'll like this, and he pulls it aside for you. That would not subject him to publisher liability, even though he's doing some curation. He's not involved in the content curation. I would argue that if the algorithms proceed in a speech neutral way, which is just to say they're going to look at your clicks and then based on your own revealed preferences, suggest other things for you to look at, I don't think that makes you a publisher necessarily.
And I think if it was
but if you do put your finger, if these engineers are putting their thumb on the scale and pushing the algorithm towards certain specific kinds of content, that may cross over.
No. You're being too specific, and it's not that extreme, and it's not as simple as you're saying. The reality is there are incredibly intricate models on a per person basis that these companies use to figure out what you're likely going to click on, not what you should, not what is exposed to you, not what you shouldn't, but what you likely will. And that's part of a much broader maximization function that includes revenue as a huge driver.
Yeah.
So the reality is that these guys are making publishing decisions. And you are right, David, that, the law back in the day, it didn't scale to the newspaper owner. But you know what? In 1796, colored people were 3/5 of a human, and we figured out a way to change the law. So I'm pretty sure we can change the law here too. And I think what's going to happen is you should be allowed to be algorithmic, but then you should live and die by the same rules as everybody else. Otherwise, that is what's really anti-competitive, is to essentially lie your way to a market advantage that isn't true, just because people don't understand what an algorithm is. That's not sufficient to me.
But they're not actually in the content creation business, right? And so what's the definition of a term publisher in that context? Because in all other cases, publishers pay for and guide and direct the editorial creation of the content versus being a kind of discriminatory function of that content.
Here's the problem. Let's take, for example, Instagram Reels. Can you manipulate content through Reels? Yes. Now, as the person that provides that tool to create content that theoretically could be violating other people's copyright or, offensive or wrong or whatever, and then you yourself distribute it to other people knowingly, the reality is that the laws need to address in a mature way the reality of what is happening today versus trying to harken back to the 1860s and the 1930s, because things are just different. And we're smart enough as humans to figure out these nuances, and that sometimes we start with good intentions and the laws just need to change.
Well, ironically, Chamath, you're making a point that Justice Thomas made in his recent filing, where he said that if you are acting as both a publisher and a distributor, you need to be subject to publisher liability, which means peeling back Section 230. And moreover, you may not even be the primary creator of the content. If you're merely a secondary creator, if you're someone who has a hand in the content, then you're a creator, you're a publisher, and therefore you should lose Section 230 protection. That is basically what he said. If your argument is that the algorithms make you a content creator effectively,
and the tools, algorithms and tools.
Then,
well, the other thing is, you have the algorithm,
because David,
you have the tools, but you also have monetization. Guys,
right? But
there's monetization involved in the YouTube example. So they are helping you.
Well,
make
we're
a
having
living.
a serious conversation, Jason. Let's not go off on that. No, I'm just kidding. No, but Chamath, I mean, this goes back to the politics make strange bedfellows point. I mean, I think a lot of the conservatives are actually making the point you're making, which is that these social media sites are involved in publishing.
I don't want these guys involved in any of this shit because I don't trust them to be neutral over long periods of time.
So do you trust their decision to pull down QAnon groups and
zero?
What they call hate groups?
Just like it took years for us to figure out that Holocaust denial was wrong, anti-vax was marginal, QAnon was crazy. Like
wearing masks was a good idea, right? I mean,
I don't want these people in charge of any of this stuff, and to the extent that they are, I want them to be liable and culpable to defend their decisions.
So, Chamath, your ideal nonprofit social media service would be a chronological feed of any content anyone wants to publish that anyone can browse and read.
That's not what I'm saying, David. What I'm saying is that you have to be able to live with the risk that comes with, playing in the big league and wanting to be a $500+ billion company. There is liability that comes with that, and you need to own it and live up to the responsibility of what it means. Otherwise, you don't get the free option.
What if they didn't take a hand in it and they follow the Reddit model and it's just upvoting that decides what content rises to the top?
I suspect that. So Reddit has just a different problem, which is a sort of like, a decency problem and a different class of law.
Who are we to judge decency, right? I mean, like in the vein of like editorialism, like they're taking no hand in what content rises to the top.
Well, they did ban certain topics. So
they did recently, but like assume they didn't, right? And it was just purely like upvoted consumer and not algorithmic.
I think it's very hard to pin. I think it's very
like
hard
a platform
to
me.
I think it's very hard to pin a Section 230 claim on Reddit, as easy as it is YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.
And so if YouTube reverted to just, hey, what people are watching right now rises to the top, and that was the only thing that drove the algorithm, you would feel more comfortable with YouTube not being...
It's not comfortable. This is what I'm saying. It's what I know. All I want to know is, what am I getting when I go here? And if what I'm getting is a subjective function where they are maximizing revenue, which means that I can't necessarily trust the content I get, as long as I know that, and as long as there's recourse for me, I'm very fine to use YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. What I think is unfair is to not know that there's a subjective function, confuse it with an objective function, go on with your life, end up in this state that we're in now, where nobody is happy and everybody is throwing barbs, and you have no solution.
Maybe I just want to be stimulated. Like, I remember the day when I would go to Facebook and Twitter and it was boring as hell. It's like just fucking random shit that people like, here's a picture of my
show
dog
me the best
taking a
stuff.
shit. Now I go to Facebook and I'm like fucking addicted because it's showing me this. And there's like shit that I've been buying online and the ads keep popping up and I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And I keep buying more stuff.
I think all of that is good, but it all should be done eyes wide open, where in these corner cases, the people that feel like some sort of right or privilege or has been violated or some overstepping has occurred, they should have some legal recourse, and there should be on the record a mechanism to disambiguate all that.
Wait, hold on a second. Let me just ask this one question, David. Mm-hmm. Would this be alleviated if the algorithm was less of a black box? If we could just say, hey, no, we need these algorithms to be, so that's not a solution. And then what is this? And I want to hear David's opinion about that algorithm, and then also labeling, because Facebook labeled stuff. And if labeling stuff, hey, this is disputed from a third party, that feels to me like that would have been a better solution in Twitter's case.
All right, let me get in here. So I half agree with Chamath. Okay, so the half I agree with is I don't want any of these people, meaning the social media sites, making editorial decisions about what I see, censoring what I can look at. I don't trust them. I don't want that kind of power residing in really two people's hands. Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey. I don't trust them, and I don't want them to have that kind of power. But where I disagree is if you repeal Section 230, you're going to make the situation infinitely worse, because Section 2, what is the response of these companies going to be? Corporate risk aversion is going to cause them to want to hire hundreds of low-level employees, basically millennials, to sit there making judgments about what content might be defamatory, might cause a lawsuit. They're going to be taking down content all over the place. And
you know what will happen?
That's going to be a worse world.
No. You know what will happen? Those companies will lose users, lose engagement, and new things will spring up in its place around these laws that work.
How will they lose audience? I mean, I think what will happen is you'll have a torrent of lawsuits. Anytime somebody has a potential lawsuit based on,
but, this reminds me of trying to police speech at a dinner party. Like
we've
never existed at a scale. This has never existed at the scale.
I don't think the goal is to work backwards from how do we preserve $1 trillion of market cap. So what if that's what happens?
I don't think that's what we're doing. So for me, I'm trying to work back from how do we preserve the open internet.
But I think this is exactly what it's saying, which is here's a clearer delineation in 2020, knowing what we know. Person entrepreneur who goes to Y Combinator or to Launch to build the next great company. Here are these rules. Pick your poison. And some will choose to be just a publisher. Some will probably create forms of distribution we can't even think of. Some will choose to straddle the line. They'll have different risk spectrums that they live on. And that's exactly how the free markets work today. There's nothing wrong with that.
Maybe the only disagreement here is that I think that code can be written and algorithms can be written in a speech neutral way, so that the distributors don't cross over the line to becoming publishers. I fully agree with you that these sites should not be publishers.